Have you ever, felt completely prepared for a task on paper?
Oh, absolutely.
Right? Like maybe you took all the right courses, you read every single recommended book, and you totally aced the evaluations,
hmm
and everyone around you, your mentors, your peers, they're all telling you that you are just the perfect fit.
Yeah, the classic golden child scenario.
Exactly. But then the moment you actually step into the role, the moment the safety net of that classroom is gone and the training wheels come off.
It just hits you like a ton of bricks.
Yes. Real methy life is suddenly staring you in the face, and you feel entirely, just profoundly unready. It's this uniquely terrifying feeling.
It really is, because you realize in a split second that, while completing a training program is not even close to the same thing as being genuinely equipped for the work.
Right. You're standing there holding all the puzzle pieces, but you have absolutely no idea how they fit together under the crushing pressure of actual human stakes.
And, it is a staggering realization. And what's fascinating is that it happens in almost every field of human endeavor. I mean, from medicine to corporate management to education.
Oh, for sure.
We have this massive tendency to build our professional confidence on this foundation of just accumulated information. Like, we operate on the assumption that if we just, acquire enough data and pass enough rigorous tests, competence will just magically follow.
Like it's an automatic download or something.
Exactly. But real life, with all its friction and office politics and emotional volatility, it has a way of ruthlessly exposing the difference between theoretical knowledge and, well, what we might call embodied readiness.
Embodied readiness. I like that. And that gap, that terrifying silent space between thinking you know how to do something and actually being able to execute it when everything is on the line, that is exactly what we are exploring in today's deep dive.
It's such a crucial topic.
It really is. So we are unpacking this profoundly insightful source document today, and it's titled Commissioned and Sent to the Nations. Now, just to set the parameters right up front for you listening, this text is specifically written about training Christian missionaries and church planters.
Right, so it is a deeply theological document making very specific religious claims.
Exactly. But as we were digging into the author's arguments, we realized that the mechanisms it describes, regarding leadership, calling, character, and readiness, they apply to literally anyone trying to turn fragmented knowledge into, real-world impact.
Oh, 100%. Whether you are leading a tech startup or stepping into middle management or even trying to teach a classroom of 30 teenagers, the organizational principles here are universally applicable.
Yeah, or like navigating a massive mid-career pivot. So our mission today is to figure out how a person actually crosses that gap from just being certified to being genuinely ready.
And to cross that gap, the source document diagnoses this fundamental structural failure in how modern institutions prepare people. The central premise really identifies this massive, quiet abyss between completing a training module and being genuinely ready to be deployed.
Right, because we are so accustomed to just equating completion with readiness.
We totally are. You finish the residency, you get the certificate, you submit the business plan, and boom, you are deemed ready to launch. But the author warns that the second you step into environments involving profound human complexity, that assumption just completely shatters.
And let's look at why it shatters. Right?
Yeah.
Because the text focuses heavily on what it calls the hidden spaces.
Ah, yes.
The hidden spaces.
Yeah, this crucial unseen formation that absolutely has to happen before anyone ever hands you a title or a microphone or, a budget. The argument is that knowledge alone does not produce a mission-ready leader.
And neither does raw enthusiasm, which is a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people. Or even a collection of, fragmented part-time experiences. So the question is, if I have the knowledge, the drive, and a little bit of experience, what is actually missing in my neural pathways or my character that causes me to just fail when the pressure hits?
Well, the author introduces this really fascinating concept of premature deployment.
Premature deployment.
Yeah. We live in this modern culture that just places an enormous premium on speed, scale, and visibility. Right? The cultural mandate is always, move fast, break things, get to the platform.
The classic Silicon Valley ethos.
Exactly. But the document suggests that the greatest risk to any mission isn't necessarily failure in the traditional sense. It is stepping into the field with only fragments of preparation.
Right.
Most training models, the text argues, they quietly fail because they inform people, but they don't actually integrate that information into the person's character.
They inspire, but they don't confirm resilience.
Exactly. They equip a person partially, but rarely release them decisively. And the result is this workforce of capable individuals who are just deeply, fundamentally uncertain.
Because competence alone just crumbles under the cognitive load of human complexity.
Right.
I want to ground this in a secular reality that, like, everyone can feel in their bones. Think about the difference between passing a written driving test and suddenly finding yourself driving a manual transmission car on a busy highway
Oh, man.
in a torrential downpour, right? Like, on paper, sitting in a quiet DMV office, you know exactly what the clutch does. You know the rules of the road.
You can ace the multiple choice test.
Exactly. But the moment the rain hits the windshield, visibility drops to zero, and this massive 18-wheeler swerves into your lane, that theoretical knowledge is practically useless unless it's been converted into pure muscle memory.
Yeah, because your brain simply does not have the processing speed to flip through a textbook in a moment of panic. You just have to know how to react.
The cognitive load is just way too high for theory. It requires integration. If training programs are failing to integrate these skills, what does true integration actually look like on the ground?
Well, that conversion from theory to muscle memory is precisely what the text means by integration. The source defines it as the point where theology, strategy, character, and practice all converge into a single coherent life.
Wow. All four of those.
Yeah. And the author uses some very striking language to describe leaders who are sent out prematurely into that metaphorical downpour you mentioned. It notes that these unintegrated leaders can articulate organizational doctrine perfectly in a calm room.
But they hesitate when real lives are at stake.
Exactly. They have these elaborate, color-coded strategic plans on paper, but they totally lack the tested internal conviction required to adapt when the environment suddenly shifts. They're just leading with fragments.
But wait, having a perfect foundational knowledge and an airtight strategic plan means absolutely nothing if the person executing it has, like, a total psychological meltdown at the first sign of criticism from a stakeholder.
Oh, completely.
So how does the text address the psychology of the leader themselves? Like, how do you move a person from holding fragments to actually possessing that integrated readiness?
The author argues that true integration can never happen if the initial underlying motivation for the work is flawed. And this is a crucial pivot in the document.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Before a leader can ever become integrated and resilient, they have to ruthlessly examine why they are doing the work in the first place. The text draws this very stark line between human ambition and divine calling.
Using a pretty powerful metaphor, right?
Yeah, it insists that any valid mission must begin at the altar before it ever reaches the platform.
The altar versus the platform. I love that. Let's really dig into the mechanism behind that metaphor because it honestly challenges the entire core ethos of modern career development.
It really does. In the biblical framework the author uses, the altar is fundamentally a place of surrender. It's this place of hidden formation, sacrifice, and psychologically speaking, the absolute death of one's own ego.
Wow. And the platform.
The platform, on the other hand, is the place of public visibility. Its influence, applause, recognition. The text points out that there is a painful, glaring difference between ambition and calling.
How does it differentiate the two?
Well, ambition operates on the frequency of, I must do something great. I want to build something impressive. I need to leave a legacy.
Which sounds pretty normal to most of us.
Right. But calling, within the context of this document, operates on the frequency of God has spoken and I must obey. Ambition often begins with the self and compulsively seeks visibility to validate its worth.
Whereas calling begins externally.
Exactly, with a summons. And it seeks faithfulness even if it means remaining entirely unseen and uncredited.
See, I have to push back on this a bit because if we translate this to the broader culture, it sounds incredibly restrictive. Like in a society that universally celebrates entrepreneurial drive, taking initiative, visionary leadership, isn't having a massive, ambitious dream considered a good thing?
It's definitely what we're taught.
We literally teach college students to, build their personal brand and make a name for themselves. So how does a person actually separate a genuine, healthy drive to build something from just plain ego dressed up in, like, noble, altruistic language?
That is arguably one of the most difficult psychological discernments anyone has to make, primarily because ambition is just incredibly skilled at disguising itself in the vocabulary of altruism or spiritual duty.
It hides behind good deeds.
It does, and the text uses several historical and biblical case studies to demonstrate how this plays out, arguing that God typically strips away a person's ambition before he commissions them.
Like who?
Well, look at the prophet Isaiah. The text notes that before Isaiah is ever sent out with a message, he has this terrifying, ego-shattering vision in the temple. He is completely undone by the holiness of God.
He realizes his own profound inadequacy.
Exactly. He requires cleansing symbolized by a hot coal to the lips in the text before he ever volunteers to go. It's a complete psychological restructuring.
He has to realize the mission isn't about his innate talent. He's not the hero.
Precisely. Or take Jeremiah. When called, Jeremiah felt entirely unready. He actively protested, citing his youth and his inability to speak well.
And God didn't just hype him up.
No. The fascinating thing is that God didn't give him a motivational speech about his hidden potential. God simply promised his divine presence.
Wow.
David is another example. Completely overlooked by his own father, left out in the obscure sheep fields, while his tall, impressive older brothers were paraded around as obvious leadership material.
Right. The classic underdog story. But there's a darker example too, right?
Yeah, perhaps the most striking psychological profile the text offers is Saul of Tarsus, who later becomes the Apostle Paul. Saul possessed fierce, violent ambition and total unyielding certainty in his religious zeal.
He was definitely not lacking in confidence.
Not at all. But that ambition had to be literally blinded and interrupted on the road to Damascus. His ego had to be systematically broken before his immense drive could be redirected toward a genuine calling.
So the underlying argument here seems to be that the deepest, most essential development of a leader's character happens almost exclusively in hiddenness and obscurity.
That's the core of it, yeah. The text actively warns against rushing to the platform just to get your dopamine hit of public approval.
There are two modern anecdotes in the document that I think perfectly highlight this tension between toxic ambition and tested calling. The story of Caleb and the story of Anna.
Oh, those two stories serve as brilliant comparative case studies. Let's look at Caleb first. Caleb is described as someone who was deeply, genuinely inspired by the idea of church planting.
He loved the concept.
Right. He loved the bold vision casting, the strong leadership language, the high-octane entrepreneurial energy of starting something from scratch. He basically had massive startup bro energy.
I think we all know a Caleb.
We do.
Yeah.
And people around him affirmed his natural charisma. So fueled by this ambition, he moved incredibly fast. He built a launch team, created a slick brand, and publicly announced his grand plans long before his own soul had been deeply grounded or tested.
Right. And the early months looked fantastic. It was like a startup catching a massive wave of initial hype. The metrics looked good. The optics were perfect.
But then, as the text points out, the inevitable friction of human reality hit.
Because the friction always hits.
It always does. Conflict with key volunteers arose. Financial strains set in when the initial funding dried up, and the sheer, crushing loneliness of bearing leadership weight became apparent.
And he didn't have the foundation to handle it.
Exactly. Because Caleb had bypassed the altar, that hidden place of ego death and character formation, and rushed straight to the platform, he just collapsed under the psychological pressure of actual shepherding.
And the author notes a really critical detail there, right? Caleb's failure wasn't due to a lack of technical skill or intelligence.
No, not at all. It was a fundamental misalignment of his core desires. He loved the concept of being a leader far more than he liked the slow, invisible, tedious work of actually caring for broken people.
He wasn't a malicious person. He was just profoundly unintegrated and unready.
Right. Now, contrast Caleb's crash and burn with the story of Anna. Anna wasn't spectacular. She wasn't flashy. She didn't launch a podcast to campaign for attention.
She certainly didn't hire a designer to build a brand identity.
No. She just had this persistent, quiet burden for a deeply neglected neighborhood in her city. She served there quietly, consistently, without a title for years.
She just showed up.
She prayed. She listened to the marginalized people in that community. She received correction without getting defensive. She just showed up day after day, long before there was any platform available to her.
And the mechanism at play here is fascinating. Because she stayed in that hidden place, allowing the obscurity of the altar to do its slow work on her ego, the people around her naturally began to notice her character.
They did. They observed that she could gather people using deep humility rather than hype. They saw her teach clearly and build genuine trust with deeply weary, cynical people.
Her calling wasn't proven by a flashy launch event or a viral marketing campaign. It was confirmed by her steady formation over time.
Exactly. So when she was finally commissioned and sent out, she didn't go as a self-made visionary. She went as a tested servant whose internal burden had been purified by time and confirmed by her community.
Which brings up a really critical transition in the text's argument. In Anna's story, it wasn't just her own internal feeling that validated her readiness.
No, it wasn't just her saying, I feel called to do this.
Right. It was the people around her looking at her life and saying, we see it too.
Hmm.
Her community recognized the integration. And that brings us to the crucial role of the community in validating a calling, which the text refers to as the Antioch model.
Yes, and this concept serves as a major corrective to how Western culture typically views calling and career progression.
How so?
Well, the modern, highly individualized imagination treats a calling as this deeply private, secret inner conviction. Like, it's a feeling you have in your heart that is sovereign, untouchable, and beyond the questioning of others.
Like, if I feel it, it must be true.
Exactly. But the source insists that while a calling is intimately personal, it is never purely private. It absolutely must be subjected to the testing of a community.
And to illustrate how this mechanism works, the text points to the church at Antioch, right, found in Acts chapter 13, as the ultimate historical blueprint for communal discernment.
Let's break down the sequence of events in Antioch because it's so countercultural.
Yeah, I was reading that section, and it really struck me that they didn't just bless Barnabas and Saul instantly. They waited. It feels like the ultimate anti-startup mentality.
It really is.
Like, the modern Silicon Valley instinct is move fast and break things. But the Antioch model seems to be slow down and test things. Did the author dive into why that delay is a feature of the system rather than a bug?
The author dives deeply into that sequence. In Antioch, the leaders of the church are gathered, worshiping, fasting, and praying. In that context of deep devotion, the text says the Holy Spirit speaks and commands them. Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them.
Okay, so a clear directive.
Yes, but notice the exact order of operations. God initiates the call first. But the church doesn't just instantly hand them a bag of money and kick them out the door that afternoon.
Right, they don't just rubber stamp it.
Exactly. The text notes that the church continues to fast, pray, and discern. They subject the divine summons to communal testing. They affirm the calling. They lay hands on them as a sign of solidarity, and then they release them.
So the community didn't manufacture the calling, but they also refused to just act as mindless cheerleaders. They recognized it, tested the character of the men, affirmed it, and responsibly released it.
That's the perfect summary. So if we apply this to modern organizations, the text is essentially warning communities to avoid two massive polarized errors when dealing with talented people who feel ready to lead.
Okay, what's the first error?
On one extreme of the spectrum, you have the arrogance of self-appointment, which is the toxic fruit of pure individualism.
This is the employee or the church member who says, God told me to do this, or my gut tells me I'm the visionary here and you have no right to question my trajectory.
Precisely. The text argues vehemently that any calling or ambition that cannot survive the loving scrutiny and counsel of a mature community should be treated with extreme suspicion.
That makes a lot of sense. And what's the other extreme?
On the exact opposite end, you have the paralysis of institutional control, or heavy bureaucracy. This happens when an organization becomes so rigid that it assumes unless the board or the CEO initiated the idea from the top down, it cannot possibly be valid.
So a healthy community finds the middle ground.
Right. It avoids both extremes. It listens to the individual's passion and burden, but it tests that burden rigorously through the objective lenses of the person's character, their observable fruit over time, and their alignment with foundational truths.
Now, the text also brings up two deeply fascinating, almost universally recognizable dysfunctions that happen within the management of organizations.
Oh, these are so good.
The first one it calls ecclesial evasion. Now, in a corporate setting, this is basically the classic cynical move of promoting your most annoying, difficult middle manager to a newly invented, completely meaningless regional director of special projects role.
Just to get them out of your office.
Yes. You just make them someone else's problem.
Yeah.
You slap a fancy title on them and ship them out because you want to evade the conflict of actually dealing with their character flaws.
That is a perfect secular translation of ecclesial evasion. Churches and organizations do it constantly. They ordain or send people away simply because they lack the courage to discipline them or tell them they aren't ready.
It's conflict avoidance masquerading as a promotion.
Exactly. But the text highlights an opposite dysfunction that is arguably much more common and insidious: hoarding talented people because the organization is terrified of losing its best assets.
I really want to spend some time on this hoarding mentality because the friction of releasing your best people is a massive organizational hurdle.
It's huge.
Like, a manager finds a brilliant employee, trains them, relies on them, and then actively sabotages their promotion to another department because it would make the manager's own life harder.
The psychological difficulty of giving away your best talent is immense, whether you are a corporate manager or a senior pastor. Organizations naturally drift towards self-preservation.
They become inwardly protective.
Yes. They begin to treat highly gifted, capable people as proprietary assets to be retained for the organization's own comfort, metrics, and success, rather than viewing them as servants meant to be released for a broader external mission.
How do the texts suggest countering that?
To counter this, the author uses a really poignant analogy. A healthy sending church acts like a mature mother.
Oh, I love this part.
Right. A healthy mother nourishes, disciplines, and raises her children specifically with the goal of releasing them into the world as capable adults. She does not infantize them or keep them dependent forever merely to soothe her own emotional need to feel useful.
Another way to look at it is the difference between a panicked corporation and a world-class university.
Expand on that.
Well, a corporation might cling to its top performers, terrified that if the lead engineer leaves, the stock price will just plummet. They operate from a mindset of absolute scarcity.
Sure.
But a great university like an Oxford or an MIT, it doesn't measure its success by how many brilliant alumni decide to stay and live in the dorms forever.
That would be a terrible university.
Right. It measures its success by the incredible world-changing people it disperses out into the globe. The entire goal of the institution is dispersion.
That concept of dispersion brings us to a profound philosophical and theological point the text makes.
Let's get into it.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the author argues that the reason a church, or any truly mission-driven community, must operate this way, freely giving away its best people, is because the community is meant to structurally mirror the very nature of God himself.
And this leads directly into what the document calls the Trinitarian heart of mission.
Now, this is where the text gets highly theological, but I want to look at how this specific theology actually changes the day-to-day stress levels of a modern leader.
Because the argument is that mission does not originate in a human boardroom or a brilliant strategic brainstorming session.
Exactly. It begins in the eternal, outward-moving nature of the triune God. The author posits that before there was ever a church to send out a missionary or a broken world to enter, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit were already existing in a perfect dynamic state of outward-moving, self-giving love.
So mission originates entirely within God.
Yes. The text breaks down the theological sequence. The Father sends the Son into the world, and it emphasizes a crucial qualitative aspect of this sending. It was a mission of condescension, not conquest.
Meaning Jesus didn't arrive with an army to dominate.
Exactly. The claim is that Christ did not arrive as a dominating CEO or a military conqueror. He came in human flesh, dwelling among the poor, the sick, and the broken, demonstrating what the author calls holy descent.
Following that, the Father and the Son send the Holy Spirit.
Right. And finally, as the culmination of this outward movement, the triune God sends the church into the world.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because by viewing yourself through this specific theological lens, seeing yourself as an ambassador rather than the visionary founder, you are essentially biologically downregulating your own stress response.
That's a great way to frame it.
Think about the modern founder's dilemma. We are conditioned to believe we have to invent the mission. We have to be the saviors of the company, the hero of the story.
Which is an impossible burden.
It is. And if the thing fails, it is a total indictment of our personal worth. But the author is arguing that if you adopt this Trinitarian view, it takes all the existential pressure off.
Completely.
You aren't inventing a mission. You are being summoned to join a mission that has been running perfectly well since before time began. You aren't the CEO. You are just the ambassador.
That paradigm shift completely alters the psychological weight of leadership. If you deeply internalize the belief that you are the author of the mission, the pressure to perform, to manufacture results, and to constantly protect your brand will eventually crush you.
It leads to the exact kind of burnout and moral collapse we discussed with Caleb.
Exactly. But if you view yourself as an ambassador, your only metric for success is faithful witness. Commissioning, therefore, is not a promotion to a higher rank in an organizational hierarchy.
It's not a celebration of personal ascent.
No, the text provocatively calls it a summons to obedient descent. You are being asked to go down into the messy, unglamorous realities of human suffering, mirroring the descent of Christ.
And the document grounds this lofty theology in a really beautiful, incredibly practical example. It describes a small, very ordinary city church where the concept of sending wasn't framed as some glamorous, highly funded overseas expedition.
It was profoundly local and ordinary.
Right. It was a retired widow who simply started hosting her isolated neighbors for afternoon tea. It was a young, busy father who carved out time to mentor fatherless boys in his community.
It was a medical worker who used her expertise to help immigrant families navigate the labyrinth of the local healthcare system.
These were just ordinary believers acting as sent witnesses in their everyday, mundane spheres. They weren't building a personal brand. They were just extending the presence of their convictions into their immediate neighborhoods.
That is the true mechanism of being sent, according to the text. It relies on deep, personal embodiment rather than public spectacle.
But the author introduces a rigorous caveat here.
A very rigorous one. If you are going to embody this mission, if you are going to join what God is doing in these messy, complex human environments, you cannot just wing it based on warm, fuzzy feelings and good intentions.
Because good intentions shatter under the weight of real trauma.
Exactly. You have to be deeply, immovably grounded in the structural truth of who God is and what reality actually is. You must have a load-bearing foundation, which brings us to the absolute bedrock of the author's argument: theology.
Now, when the average person hears the word theology, they usually picture dusty academic textbooks or endless abstract debates over Greek verbs.
Or just decorative religious language that sounds nice on a Sunday but doesn't actually matter when you're trying to pay rent on Monday.
Right, exactly. But this source insists that theology is not decorative at all. It argues that theology is structural.
It is the rebar inside the concrete.
Yes, it is the hidden architecture that makes everything else hold together when the chaotic weight of the world presses down on the organization.
The author views theology as the very physics of the mission, and the text warns of a highly specific danger facing modern churches.
What's the danger?
Well, when the core message, the gospel, is stripped of its cosmic weight and reduced to just a simple, highly individualized formula for personal salvation, the community becomes incredibly fragile.
Without a robust, comprehensive theology that addresses all of reality, the church becomes vulnerable to constant improvisation.
Exactly. It starts making massive organizational decisions based on fleeting cultural trends, or the charismatic personality of the founder, or whatever aesthetic keeps the consumer base happy and donating.
The text uses the book of Ephesians, specifically chapter 2, to argue that a church is meant to be a covenant community, a group of naturally hostile people reconciled to God and to each other, not just a curated brand.
And there is a massive psychological difference between a brand and a community.
Totally. A brand is built entirely on aesthetics, music styles, and consumer preferences. It requires constant curation to remain appealing. But if you build a brand on aesthetics, what happens when cultural tastes inevitably change?
The foundation cracks and the brand loses its market share. That constant curation is exhausting and ultimately hollow.
So how does theology fix that?
Theology, the author argues, is what protects the church from devolving into a fragile mirror that merely reflects the founder's personality or the current cultural zeitgeist. If the theological premise is that Christ is the one building the church, then the planter or pastor is demoted to the role of a mere steward.
That relieves a lot of pressure.
It does. But the text insists that for this to work, theology must become a reflexive instinct. It cannot just be a beautifully worded statement hidden on the About Us page of a website. It has to become the organization's muscle memory.
How does that actually look in a moment of crisis?
Well, when a massive, emotionally charged conflict arises and the community is threatening to tear itself apart over a disagreement, reflexive theology is what steps in and dictates the response.
Give me an example.
It says, "We believe Christ is Lord over this conflict, therefore we will pursue the painful work of reconciliation, rather than just legally crushing the opposing side to win the argument."
Or when budgets are tight.
Right. When the organization's budgets are terrifyingly tight and panic sets in among the staff, reflexive theology says, "We believe God is ultimately faithful and our provider, therefore we will not compromise our ethics, exploit our donors, or cut corners just to secure funding." It dictates behavior under pressure.
I want to push back on this, just playing devil's advocate for a moment.
Yeah.
It is very easy for us to sit here and talk about theology as this grand, load-bearing architecture.
Sure.
But put yourself in the shoes of a leader in the trenches. If you are running a community center or a church, and you are just trying to help hurting people, trying to keep the lights from being shut off, and you are dealing with a violent addict in crisis in your lobby on a random Tuesday afternoon.
Yeah, the real world.
Does all this high-level cosmic theology actually change the outcome of that Tuesday?
The author would argue that it makes all the difference in the world, specifically regarding the leader's survival. Without a deep theological framework, that leader in the lobby will attempt to solve deep spiritual and psychological crises using only their own human ingenuity and emotional reserves. They will try to be the savior for that addict.
And relying on your own emotional reserves to fix human brokenness is a mechanism for rapid, severe burnout.
It is exhausting and ultimately barren.
Because you take the failure personally. If the addict relapses, you feel like you failed rather than recognizing the complexity of their brokenness.
Exactly. The text shares a very telling story about a church that started with massive entrepreneurial energy. They had great momentum, incredible music, and huge crowds.
Right.
But because their underlying theology was remarkably thin, their programs quickly began outpacing their actual discipleship. The leadership conversations behind closed doors stopped being about holiness or character formation and started revolving entirely around attendance, metrics, efficiency, and crowd retention.
The classic hype machine.
The ultimate hype machine. And the church began fracturing under its own weight because it had no solid center to hold the massive crowd together when suffering hit. It was a mile wide and an inch deep.
How do they survive?
The author notes that it was only by deliberately slamming the brakes on their own growth, dismantling the hype machine, and returning to slow, rigorous, deep theological teaching that the leadership found coherence again.
They had to stop entertaining the crowd and start teaching the people why they existed in the first place.
Right. Theology didn't just give them smart things to say, it gave them organizational durability.
Okay, so theology gives truth its shape and its durability.
Hmm.
But as we established earlier, truth cannot just float in the theoretical ether.
No, it cannot.
It has to physically hit the ground in a specific zip code and a specific neighborhood with specific people who carry specific historical wounds. The text uses this brilliant phrase, love has to learn to think.
I love that phrase.
Me too. And that phrase pulls us out of the realm of pure abstract theology and directly into the realm of strategy.
Strategy is a concept where a surprising number of deeply theological or highly idealistic people stumble.
Why is that?
They often carry this psychological bias, a myth the author calls holy improvisation.
Holy improvisation.
Yeah, this is the false, almost romanticized idea that making plans, using spreadsheets, or doing demographic research is somehow a demonstration of a lack of faith.
They operate on the assumption that if you are truly, authentically led by the Spirit, you shouldn't need a strategy. You should just show up, open your mouth, and let God miraculously organize the details.
But the document rigorously shatters this myth. It states unequivocally that strategy is not the enemy of faith. It is the practical expression of stewardship.
People think holy improvisation is like playing jazz music. They think jazz is just a musician walking on stage, closing their eyes, and playing random notes based entirely on raw emotion.
Right, which is completely wrong.
It's a complete misunderstanding of the art form. A great jazz musician has spent 10,000 grueling hours practicing scales, studying music theory, and mastering chord progressions. The improvisation on stage only works because the structural strategy of the music has become pure muscle memory.
You cannot improvise beautifully if you don't actually know the scales.
Exactly.
That is a phenomenal analogy for what the author is describing. Strategy is learning the scales of the neighborhood. The text points straight to Jesus' teaching in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 14, where he explicitly tells his followers to calculate the cost before building a tower, mocking the idea of starting a project without a budget.
And the Old Testament talks about this too, right?
Yes, it points to the book of Proverbs, which constantly commends the hard work of seeking wise counsel and making careful plans. The author argues that studying the field, conducting what it calls demographic discernment, is an actual, tangible act of neighbor love.
It is the equivalent of a secular organization conducting deep, empathetic market research.
Exactly. You cannot effectively love a neighborhood if you arrogantly refuse to understand its historical rhythms, its socioeconomic pain points, and its cultural language.
So how does the text differentiate between healthy strategy and just being a control freak?
The author unpacks the vital, nuanced difference between faith-filled planning and spiritual presumption.
Spiritual presumption.
Yeah, it's essentially arrogance cloaked in religious language. It forces a prepackaged agenda onto a community, ignores obvious financial or cultural constraints, refuses to budget responsibly, and then labels that reckless behavior as faith just to avoid doing the tedious hard work of careful thought.
And faith-filled planning.
Faith-filled planning, however, is responsive, highly observant, and deeply dependent on God, while simultaneously utilizing every single ounce of human wisdom, data, and counsel available.
The text highlights the Apostle Paul's approach in 1 Corinthians 9, where he famously writes about adapting his approach to different audiences, becoming a Jew to win the Jews, becoming weak to win the weak. He was a master strategist.
He really was.
He never once compromised or changed the core message of the gospel, but he constantly, fluidly adjusted his delivery methods based on the cultural context of his audience.
The author takes a hard line here, arguing that while the core truth is non-negotiable, the strategy used to deliver it must be infinitely adjustable.
To illustrate the necessity of adjusting your strategy, the source details a very relatable case study of an eager, highly trained church planter who arrived in a new city.
Oh, this story's so good.
He came armed with a rigid, pre-packaged playbook of massive launch events, direct mail marketing, and large public gatherings, like a strategy that had worked perfectly for him in a different part of the country.
But instead of just blindly executing his playbook on day one, he actually stopped to practice demographic discernment.
He went on a listening tour.
Yes. He spent months just walking the neighborhoods, sitting in local coffee shops, hosting quiet dinners, and listening to the residents.
And what he discovered completely invalidated his playbook.
Right. Entirely. He realized his initial strategic assumptions were completely wrong for that specific culture. The people in this new city were deeply cynical and highly suspicious of large, slick religious events.
A massive marketing campaign would have actually alienated them.
Exactly. However, he discovered they were also incredibly lonely, isolated, and starved for genuine, low-pressure hospitality. So he threw out his playbook and pivoted his entire strategy.
He slowed his timeline way down.
He focused entirely on building networks of small, table-based relationships in people's homes. His slow, patient strategy matched the actual lived reality of the field. He learned the scales of the neighborhood so he could play the right music.
Okay, let's synthesize where we are. We have the theology, which gives us the structural what and the why. We have the strategy, which gives us the contextual how and the where.
Right.
We know what the foundational truth is, and we have a culturally aware plan for how to deliver it. But here is the ultimate bottleneck. How does a leader ensure they don't personally, psychologically collapse under the immense weight of actually executing that strategy day in and day out?
Because knowing the plan on a whiteboard and surviving the execution of the plan over a decade are two entirely different things.
Exactly. And that leads us to the final and perhaps most crucial piece of the author's puzzle: practice.
Practice is the crucible. It is the forge where all the theory is tested. The text defines practice as the literal bridge between learning in a classroom and deployment in the field.
It is the exact repetitive space where theoretical conviction is converted into that muscle memory we talked about earlier.
And the source offers a very sobering, urgent warning here. A leader may possess a brilliant orthodox theology, and they may execute a flawless, data-driven strategy, but if they lack character, if their internal, emotional, and spiritual life is unformed, they are a deeply dangerous liability.
They are highly gifted, yet structurally unstable.
As the text succinctly puts it, practice reveals what theory conceals.
This goes back to the driving in the rain analogy. You can easily fake a good theology exam by memorizing the right answers. You can hire a consulting firm to design a brilliant demographic strategy for you.
But you absolutely cannot fake how your nervous system reacts when your most trusted volunteer betrays you.
Right. You can't fake your response when the funding completely dries up and you have to make payroll. You can't fake humility when you are exhausted, burned out, and facing public, unfair criticism.
Exactly, because leadership character is formed in the mundane crucible of repetition. How a leader repeatedly handles interpersonal conflict, how they repeatedly process their own failures, how they repeatedly receive harsh criticism, that repetitive action is what physically and spiritually shapes their soul.
It hardwires them.
Yes. If a leader repeatedly responds to pressure with defensiveness and blame, defensiveness becomes their hardwired neurological instinct. If they repeatedly practice confession, active listening, and humility, then humility becomes their instinct when the crisis hits.
This raises a massive, vital question for any organization, whether it's a church, a university, or a corporation? How do our training environments allow leaders to fail safely, receive honest, unvarnished correction, and grow over time without destroying the organization?
The local church, the text argues, is meant to be a workshop of character, a safe place to practice, not just a sterile classroom for intellectual debate.
So if you are listening to this right now, maybe you're on your commute or sitting at a desk in a job where you feel completely overqualified and overlooked, how do you know if your own muscle memory is forming correctly?
That's the million-dollar question.
How do you know if you are actually becoming ready for the thing you want to do?
The author suggests you look at your hidden life. Look at how you behave when there is no audience and no immediate reward. True readiness takes an agonizing amount of time, and the text emphasizes that God rarely, if ever, hurries the formation of a servant.
The forging process happens through hiddenness.
Through hiddenness, through professional disappointment, and through the long, quiet, unglamorous ache of ordinary obedience. The source relates the story of a young man named Emmanuel to illustrate this.
Tell us about Emmanuel.
Well, Emmanuel was highly gifted, naturally charismatic, and incredibly eager for the spotlight. He wanted the platform immediately, and he had the raw talent to justify it. But his mentors, practicing the wise communal discernment we discussed with the Antioch model, deliberately kept him in ordinary, unglamorous, behind-the-scenes roles in the church for years.
If you're a high performer, that has to feel like you were being punished. He must have felt like he was being benched by managers who were just jealous of his talent.
The text notes that he felt incredibly delayed, frustrated, and overlooked. But those hidden, frustrating years were doing a vital, surgical work on his soul.
They were stripping away the ego.
Exactly. The obscurity was actively exposing his deep need for public approval and purifying his underlying motives. He was learning how to serve when absolutely no one was clapping for him. He was building deep muscle memory in humility, patience, and endurance.
And the payoff was massive.
It was. Years later, when he was finally commissioned and sent out to lead, his highly visible public story was backed by a massive, durable, tested, private story. He didn't break under the intense psychological pressure of the spotlight because his character had been forged in the dark.
It all comes together in this beautiful, holistic synthesis that the text refers to as the garment of readiness. You can't just have one piece. You have to weave all three threads together to survive.
Precisely. Theology gives the truth its structural shape and weight. Strategy gives that truth its cultural direction and application. Practice gives that truth its resilient durability in the real world.
The author argues that if you leave these elements separate, they are just fragile, loose threads that will easily snap under the chaotic pressure of real-world leadership.
But when you weave them tightly together, when your deep structural knowledge of reality informs a wise, context-aware strategy, and both of those are carried out by a character that has been repeatedly forged in the hidden spaces of obedience, you create a durable garment of readiness.
That is the exact moment when a student truly becomes a messenger. It is a profound, almost jarring paradigm shift.
It really is.
We started this deep dive talking about that terrifying gap between completing a training program and actually being ready to face the real-world execution of the work. And what we've discovered through this text is that true readiness isn't a piece of paper you can frame on your office wall.
It isn't passing a multiple-choice test.
No. It is a grueling, beautiful, lifelong synthesis. It requires an authentic calling, rigorous testing by a community that loves you enough to tell you no, unshakable theological or structural depth, adaptive, strategic wisdom that listens before it speaks, and the resilient muscle memory that is only forged in the quiet, unglamorous, hidden spaces of our lives.
It is the sobering realization that whether we are talking in theological terms or organizational terms, the goal is not merely to find capable people to execute a series of tasks. The goal is the formation of integrated people who possess the character to bear the weight of their responsibilities without being crushed by them.
And while this deep dive was rooted in a text specifically making claims about church planting and missionary work, I want you to think about how these exact psychological and organizational principles apply to any great calling, ambition, or transition in your own life right now.
It's universally applicable.
It is. Think about the hidden place you might find yourself in today. That job where you feel delayed, that role where you feel overlooked, that season of life where you are intensely frustrated by the lack of visible progress or applause.
That's a hard place to be.
Are you frantically rushing to build a brand and get to the platform? Or are you allowing the quiet obscurity of the altar to do its deep, necessary, ego-shattering work in your character? What if the delay you are so incredibly frustrated by right now isn't a denial of your potential at all?
That's the paradigm shift.
What if that delay is the exact forge required to build the muscle memory you desperately need, so that you don't completely shatter into pieces when you finally get the very thing you've been asking for?
That is the quiet, often painful miracle of practice and preparation.
Something to deeply mull over as you navigate your own gap between the classroom and the storm, between your preparation and your deployment. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.